Hey everybody, I'm Sean Robinson.
I'm Carson Grubaugh. Welcome to Live in the Line. Today we have a guest that I'm really excited about, someone who I have been following his career for a long time and considered a real innovator. His work, like going back, I think the first time I saw it was on Jay Lee's Hell Shock, really changed my mind about what coloring in comics was. And then someone who started doing experiments with photography and Photoshop in comics. Veils, is that the one off the top of my head? And some stuff in Promethea that really, again, changed my mind about what comics could do. And then now, recently has been, I think, kind of pushing the game in terms of restoration of color. Some of the experiments I've seen you do on Instagram is like, yes, that's how I want my omnibuses to be recolored. And then had just recently done a restoration of Bernie Wrightson Swamp Thing and is working on and will have coming out an amazing restoration from what I've seen of Richard Corben's work. The color work I've seen on there is like, wow, his work looked like that. So we're really excited to talk to Mr. Jose Villarubia. I think one of the best colorists in the game.
How you doing, Jose?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Well, we've been chasing you for a while. We've been talking about you in bits and pieces because there's so many different strands of what is so right about this moment of the industry. Somebody who takes the time to look at the things that happened before and acknowledge them and incorporate them into the contemporary work that they're making. I mean, it's just you have a tremendous body of work, and I really personally am appreciative of the way that you have extended that into the technical and preserving some of these things that are otherwise going to be forgotten.
I'm curious, just like hearing your entry into comics, because like I said, my first exposure to you, it was just the type of coloring I've never seen. So how did you get into comics and like bringing that new approach to coloring? I'm curious about that, and then we can move forward from there.
I'd make the short version of the story because I can be long-winded. But when I was a kid, I always wanted to work in comics. And when I was a teenager, I started publishing illustrations in fanzines, and I won a comics contest in Spain. And then I came to the States and I applied at Marvel and DC, and I got rejection letters. And so I continued reading comics, but I forgot about drawing comics. And instead, I went on to pursue a degree in fine arts and later on a degree in painting, an MFA. I became a teacher. And then because of being a teacher, one of my students was Greg LaRocque, and he got me the foot in the door, the proverbial foot in the door, to do pinups for Who is Who in the Legion of Superhero. I was offered more work from DC, which I rejected to my surprise, because I was really happy painting my own work. And years later, I met Jay Lee. I was part of the board of directors of a local art center. I curated a show of local artists. He lived in Virginia. He was very young. We became really good friends. Within a year, he rose to meteoric fame. I started working for Image, did work with Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee, and then he was offered to create his own series. Digital coloring was just getting started at that time. Most digital coloring was done still on PCs with painters that were not Photoshop. Programs that were not Photoshop. They would do banding, for example, for the gradients and stuff. Jay really intensely disliked the look of digital coloring. And when he created Hellshock, he asked me if I could paint it. We had been talking about art all the time since we met, and we both admired painted comics like Dave McKeon, Bill Sienkiewicz, Kent Williams, John J. Muth, George Pratt. And basically, I told him, sure. I never thought about coloring anything, but I could paint. So, and he knew I could paint because I was a painter. Right. So it wasn't about coloring, like filling the spaces. It was about taking a painterly approach to the whole thing. So I learned Photoshop so I could do it because I didn't know how to do it. we were told it was impossible to scan painted colors and overlap the line art. But I learned Photoshop. I figured out how to overlap the line art on the painted pages and adjust it in Photoshop. And that's how my career began.
So I didn't realize that was your first work. It was just my first exposure to a comic that had painted colors. And I immediately started getting like pen and ink and vellum and trying to recreate that because it opened me up to art in comics. It's interesting that that's your first one.
My
And
first thing was Hell Shock. I did 2 series. The first one, I didn't know Photoshop, so we were working with a technician who told us it was impossible to scan my color guides. So he copied the brushstrokes and stuff.
Right.
And I was, Jay, this is just BS. I just don't know how to do it, but I know it can be done. The second series, I just learned Photoshop. I scanned the colors and I put the line on top, and that was that.
It's amazing how many times a technician will just tell you no, or that's impossible, or the human eye can't perceive, or the amount of times that I've heard something like that that just turns out to be patently false as long as you look to the next step of the technical, like it's a gatekeeper,
Well, exactly. I think that a lot of people that work in technical roles in comics, they have a method to do things that they've been using forever.
Right.
And I had to fight with production in many different companies many times. For example, to get the pages that I color, I want them in grayscale. I don't want them in bitmap.
Right.
And I heard a million times that you cannot use bitmap, that you cannot use grayscale. You have to use bitmap, which gets rid of all the textures and grays and washes and all that stuff. I had to fight to do the early Corben restorations. I was told no, and I can talk about that a little later. So, but it's not their fault. It's just they know one way to do it. They can't think about opening it up, because if it didn't work for whatever reason, it's on them. So they're not there to be creative. They're there to make sure you put out a quality product. So they are not. What incentive is there to be experimental? They don't get their names in the books. They don't get extra pay for coming up with a good method to do it. So I totally understand them and I empathize with them, because they don't have the most glamorous job.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it seems like you have become a supreme technician because of like, okay, I got to be the one to figure this out because I am the guy who's being named as the colorist. And you've developed a lot of techniques, it seems like. Like, can you explain more about the grayscale versus the bitmap? You're talking about outputting all 4 channels as a grayscale plate to print from? I didn't quite understand.
You're talking about the original art having nuances that you want to preserve, as opposed to converting to a bitmap for the line art
Exactly.
itself.
When you scan an image with a scanner, a black and white page, there's many ways to scan it. The traditionally in comics, they have traditionally is not at all a tradition, because this is only from digital comics, but because you couldn't do anything else at the time, they would scan them at extremely high resolution, like 1200 dpi points per inch, and instead of scanning it in RGB in color or in grayscale in grays, they would scan it in bitmap, which meant either black pixels or white pixels.
Right, direct to bitmap instead of letting
okay.
that
We're talking about the black and white line work. Then I thought you were talking about outputting the color,
which is especially somebody like somebody like Jay Lee, who uses so much dry brush and hints of wash and things like that. A direct to bitmap scan on a scanner that is not optically very very sharp means that all those things are blown out before you're even seeing the art for the first time.
Exactly. No, my first person that I colored was Jay Lee, and the second person that I colored was Bill Sienkiewicz. So it was all dry brush and and tonal stuff and
And there are technical ways to still convert that to a bitmap and preserve many of those things, but they don't involve direct bitmap scanning. You don't.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, like the only thing that I do when I use grayscale line art is I just make sure that the black is black. I make sure that it's sharp. I make sure that it doesn't have any stains from the paper or blue line or anything like that. But that's it. It's just little touches. But the very, basically the thing that bitmap is problematic in scanning is that it fills in all any kind of texture that may be in the black, and it fades anything that is in light gray, because it was done maybe it was inked with a brush, and it's light gray and it just disappears. So with grayscale you preserve everything, and you don't have to scan it at 1200. You can scan it 600. Is already, you can make it the size of a wall and it would look sharp.
Yeah, Sean's a real big proponent of 600 DPI in color.
As an archival purpose as well, mentally, one of the things that I'm always, if I talk to somebody about that, it's like, even if you're going to end up turning it into a bitmap, what are you going to do 30 years down the road if somebody wants to do a color edition of this, or they want to look at the actual, board for some reason and see the notes that you wrote to yourself or whatever, there's no reason to not just keep that intermediate step.
Exactly.
As an archive for yourself. It's a different kind of mentality. And then when you see somebody like, the project that you're working right now with Richard Corben, I mean, it would be impossible to do another edition of Den that looked the way that it does had he not preserved, the elements. So what do you actually have physically? What did you have access to for this particular book? Because I mean, it's a pretty peculiar process he used.
Well, I've known for a long time that Corben, Richard, and his wife, for almost 20 years, they've been doing periodic sales in their website of original art at very reasonable prices, by the way. That was something intentional because Richard really wanted collectors to be able to afford his work. But it's kind of like a crazy option system that is very hard to get what you want, and I've only been successful a couple of times. I know that the one thing he never sold, the only thing as far as I know, was Den. He kept all the Den art from all the 5 volumes plus, except for volume 3, Children of Fire, which doesn't really have Den as we know him, and he sold those pages. So I talked to the widow, Donna, and I convinced her to scan all of the work at 600 DPI in color and send it to me. And that was great for issue 1, for volume 1, great for volume 2. Volume 3 was a challenge because the pages were sold. I bought a bunch, so that was good. Donna had about 15, so that was good. And then I've been tracking the collectors internationally in this manhunt that you can imagine, a woman hunt too. I located all but one page. So
fantastic.
And then for 4 and 5 and 6, Donna has them. So I knew about a decade ago, Philip Simon, who was my editor in Conan for Dark Horse, was also the editor for the Creepy and Eerie series. And because he was friends with me, I asked him, I begged him that whenever it came the time to reprint Corben's Creepy and Eerie stories, to please let me do it. And there was no budget, of course. They were just planning to scan the magazines and like they do with, like everybody does with everything else. Well, those stories printed, the black and white ones printed well. Considering the color printed terrible.
Right.
I mean, absolutely terrible. So thanks to Philip, I was able to restore those stories. It took me almost a year. Corben actually contributed with many original scans, which he still had at the time, he was very supportive. And some collectors that I contacted also sent me the work. And then what I did, that was a crazy amount of research, because since the stories have been printed in many, many foreign publications, I sort of tried to figure out what was the best components for each page from whatever printing. So, for example, a French edition may have a printed page where maybe the magenta is too light. Well, that allows me to see the cyan and the yellow better. So I could add the magenta from a different edition. So I actually use several sources in many of the pages. Some were, in my opinion, unredeemable because they were just so insanely dark that I did my best, and they look better than they printed originally. There's a handful of those, but the majority look good. Corben was thrilled. He was very supportive. He spoke highly of those restorations in print and interviews, and he would consult with me for digital matters since then, which was very flattering. I got him a platter. So that was my first time restoring him. And each page was a challenge, and each page was a different challenge where I learned so much and I had so much fun. So by the time it came like 10 years later, when, you know, finally then was going to be re-released, I was ready to do it, but there's not a formula that I apply to each page. Every page is a different challenge. So even though I had all the original sources, which made the work a lot easier, he manipulated the printing plates. So you can't just colorize that gray tone because the gray tone doesn't correspond to the value of the colors. So each one is different, and it's fun, but really it's very difficult. And like I'm being asked to do tutorials all the time and stuff. It's like, there's no tutorial. Well, I mean, you know, yeah, I can do like a whole course on like, you know, the 50 different things you can do depending on the page, but it doesn't make any sense. It's just...
Well, so tell us about his actual physical process then, because having seen, you know, an original or two, I mean, he painted a grayscale image, and then they would shoot some kind of separation from that for Den in particular, and then he would manipulate the separations that were generated by the photographer.
He did more than that. He actually had his own copy camera, and he would actually like. In the beginning, what he did is like he would do the black and white piece. He would shoot it. He would shoot it light, and then he would put acetates to create each one of the printing plates. That, or he would just print the page light, and then he would make, like, if something was going to be red, he would make the magenta black and the yellow black.
Right.
Eventually, that became an insanely elaborate method by the time he was working on Den and Mitten World and all that stuff, where he would do 3 different exposures on acetates for each one of the 3 colors and 1 for the white. But then he would overexpose the white on purpose and things like that. So the description is in a book called Flights into Fantasy, and it's, even if you're an expert,
right,
it's impossible to follow. There's just, you know, 3 exposures for each color, 4 exposures for each color. Each one of the 3 is 12 different exposures, plus the black plate.
Wow.
So it was extraordinarily time consuming. He got incredible amount of control out of it. Surprisingly, he would only see the color once he was in print. And those films have been long lost. I actually saw in an auction, they had a lot of his Warren films, and you can even see in the in that lot that different stories were colored in a different way. That's why he could get those incredible, his inspiration was Maxfield Parrish.
Right.
And Maxfield Parrish famously painted in primary colors, imitating a photographic process. He would paint with magenta, he would paint with cyan, he would paint with yellow, and he would put coats of varnish in between. He was breaking down the colors and sort of doing like his painted version of highly realistic, but very saturated photographic process. So I think that was Corben's inspiration from doing it with a copy camera. And he did it all the way until Children of Fire. And then he gave up because, even working at top speed and working all the time like he did, it took him forever to do those comics. So he started coloring photocopies. He started doing blue line, like for the Turtles Take Time, the Ninja Turtle things. He started playing with a computer, but the computer programs that he was using, I don't even think he was using a lot of 3D programs and stuff. Everything was super low res, so he really struggled with that at first. And eventually he settled, for the past 10 years or so, I would say, he settled into pen and ink, or brush and ink. Marker and ink is what he used mostly. And then just what we would call regular mainstream coloring, but done by him many times and sometimes by myself or other colorists.
I've been thinking about this for, knowing we're going to talk to you about this and about his particular development. And I want to say first off that there's no comparison to me for Parrish and him in terms of skill level, because Parrish got to see the results as he's making it. The pre-visualization that's required to make a full color image out of multiple exposures of four negatives is just insane. Do you think that his animation background helped him in that sense, that he had experience? Animation being, further removed, I'd say, than the typical cartooning process in terms of the pre-visualization required to, you don't actually get to see the thing until you're at the flip stage,
That's an interesting point I never thought about. I know that certainly his animation helped him with storytelling, developing his storytelling skills. But most of what he did in animation, other than his personal projects, was technical animation, like the way the machines work and stuff like that.
Okay.
And I believe it was mostly in black and white.
Okay.
So I think that he must have been extremely methodical to begin with, which is something that are skills you can apply to animation or to printmaking, or to what he did, which was sort of like artisanal mechanical printmaking.
Right.
But I think that in animation, you see each drawing, at least. In this one, you see the base for the drawing, but you just don't know how it's going to look like rendered, because so much of the rendering is going to happen with the color. So it's inconceivable. I think it's like a miracle. And the best that I can do, of course, is just to find the best sources for the colors, to average them, because none of them, they're not two identical pages of anything by him, and also to use a little bit of guesswork, and also my own intuition about the printing. A lot of it is things that I cannot prove, but I believe aesthetically, knowing his work, that page may just not really have enough cyan for what he wanted, or too much. And that's kind of guesswork, that it's a little bit subjective. It's not a mechanical thing.
So you didn't have access, all you had access to were the scans of the original black and white, and then
Mhm.
the decisions you're making about color are just based on however many reproductions you can get a hold of.
Yeah, I already had like tons because
Okay.
I've been obsessed with him since I was 14. So I think I have like 5 or 6 copies of Den 1, you know. I bought them in many languages because I would buy them in Spain. I would buy them here. Some I bought in France too. And some I would pull out of magazines. I mean, I'm a nut. So
We should just say, I mean, just to put a stamp here that it is a shame that the physical assets of these important materials are not protected by the publishers that are entrusted with them or the estates. I mean, it is shocking to me. We live in a world where you can still find the actual physical negatives of obscure films from the 30s and 40s, and yet some of the most popular comics that were ever created in the moved cultures are treated like a photocopy is okay. It's just
absolutely, I
it's
think that the in back in the day, he actually taught the publisher, the editor, he taught his method of coloring to the editor-in-chief at Warren at the time, and he used it like on Esteban Moroto and other artists, but very basically. It was more successfully used in some of the spirit stories that Warren published. There's some that are really pretty nicely colored, and it looks very Corben-esque, but it's not Corben. He also had those 2 assistants, husband and wife team, Herb and Diane Arnold. He passed away, but she's still with us. And eventually what he started, he contributed to his fanzines like Fanagore and stuff. And eventually what he started to do was to make color guides for them. They would follow the color guides. And that's how much of the end part, which is like mid-70s, of his color separation work was done. And it's a miracle that Herb and Diana could do as much as they did. That's how Bloodstar was colored. Some of the Catalan reprints of like Werewolf and Poe were colored by them with Corben's color guides. I'm actually thrilled that I've been able to acquire the color guides for Bloodstar. I have them, and they're. You want to see them?
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
They're insane.
Yeah, please.
Nobody has seen this. They're absolutely like, what? So he took a issue of Bloodstar, like one of the first editions, which were all limited edition, very beautifully printed on matte paper. And then basically he hand colored and annotated every single page. And
what is he coloring with?
color
Markers?
pencils.
Color pencils. Okay.
Yeah, and you know that to make these intense colors, he went like with a lot of vigor. And
it pushed hard.
yeah.
Wow.
The rendering on that face there, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
And
he's very distinctive, even between cross media. That's very interesting to see that curve of the face there.
Unfortunately, this is almost complete, but there are about 30 pages that were pulled out, and I'm sure given as souvenirs or something.
And that looks like a bound book. He had it printed and then he colored on a printed bound
No,
book.
this was the first edition of Bloodstar. It was a limited edition. It's actually signed by him. This is the number something in that edition. But the colors are absolutely fantastic. And
yeah,
I would like to eventually do a colorized version of Bloodstar following these color guides extremely closely.
Right.
Much closer than, Herb and Diane were able to. Yeah, this is number 83 of 5,000.
Okay.
wow. So that must be really instructive when you're doing your coloring, uh, because I'm assuming that even like when you're posting on Instagram, what you're posting is like, this is what it looked like in print and this is what I'm doing. The saturation on what you're doing is way higher. So it had to have been difficult to figure out what it should have looked like without any color guides from him based on desaturated copies. That seems like a really difficult process to me.
Sometimes it's saturated, sometimes oversaturated. I mean, it goes both ways. They were printed very poorly, and because his color guides, his color separations, I can't even imagine the ink limits in these things, because he would put areas that had 100% cyan, 100% magenta, 100% yellow, and black, and it's like,
He's driving the printer crazy.
yeah. So I mean, like, it's a miracle that it even worked, because they were just they had a lot of pigment in them. So, but sometimes the printed faded, because I guess the printer would adjust it and say, hell, just
Right.
let's make everything like 50% of what he gave us. And
Yeah, they don't want to stop the press every 45 minutes to clean
exactly.
the blankets, and so they're giving up and just backing off all the way.
So what I do, which is the same thing I did with the Wrightson thing, is that I scan the colors, but then I bought a special lamp, and I really, really, really look at the color and try to adjust it in my monitor. So it's not just a straight scan, because the scan is an impression of it. But
Yeah.
for example, if something is magenta, it's not going to scan magenta. It's going to scan magenta and other things. So I can go back and correct it and make it 100% magenta, and things like that. So, it's, as I said, it's a subjective thing combined with like trying to follow the sources as closely as possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Mhm.
it sounds like there's some bit of like I can just straight go into the color picker in Photoshop and work with numbers because I know it's supposed to be 100%, but then see it on screen and be like, no, that doesn't look quite right. Let me go adjust it a little bit.
Yeah, I don't do it with numbers because I actually work on RGB.
Okay.
So there's just a lot of things that you can do in RGB that you cannot do in CMYK. So when I'm restoring these, I would, for example, I've been working in RGB on a page, and then I realized that this background is just 100% cyan. So then what I would do is I would change it temporarily to CMYK, go into the cyan channel, make that black, make it 100% cyan, and then bring it back. So that would change it. The 100% cyan won't stay 100% cyan, but it's closer than if I tried to do it in RGB that way. So I go between both when restoring Corben in particular.
Yeah, anytime you're working with a scan of something that was printed in that process, that's an easy way to manipulate those individual things. Is go into that individual channel. I'm not saying this, by the way, to Jose. I'm saying this to our audience who's listening.
Who does can your audience follow what we're talking about? Because this is like really.
That's a good question.
I never given such minute details, because most people is like, just make it look good.
No, a lot of
Yep.
people came to the channel initially because Sean was doing similar talks about reproducing
art.
line work.
Yeah, line art restoration. I have restored almost 5,300 pages of Cerebus the Aardvark.
Oh,
And
fabulous.
in a similar kind of fashion, in that every page is represented by whatever source is the best that's available. And so for the later books, I might have as much as 95% of the original artwork in the exact way that I specified. Give me the color scan at 600 pixels per inch, and I can convert it to a bitmap with a long, involved process. And then in other sources, I might have just a newsprint scan, and I had to develop some of these things, like how do you make this sit alongside the other thing. But I'm doing a color book right now, and it's printed, it's scanned from print copies that were done in a traditional, colored with acetate overlays with when we say CMYK, we're talking about the 4 color print plates that are going to make up the previously made up the printed image.
Oh, if you hold on a second, I'll go grab a print plate. I have one hanging around.
So
this is I did in high school. I printed my own comic, and I just found the other day the original. We did it on both sides.
That's very cool.
This is a lithographic. This is what Sean's talking about when he's talking about the print plate.
Yeah, and so traditional comics, were colored with essentially like Ruby Lith cutouts, and each of these things is going to generate the final image. And so when you are restoring something or trying to reprint something from the actual print scan, one of the easiest manipulations you can do is put it back in that same color space, so that when you can manipulate each of those channels individually in Photoshop.
That's right.
And so when Jose is saying that he's going back and forth between the color spaces, RGB is providing the full gamut, what's called a wide gamut, where every color that you would conceivably want to see is represented in that space. But by converting it temporarily to the other space that more closely represents what the original printing looked like, he's able to manipulate each of those channels on an individual basis. And boy, oh boy, is that an amazing technique and tool. You can go in and use averaging filters like the median filter and get rid of a lot of noise.
Absolutely.
Selectively blur things.
Yeah, because when I scan the colors, I have to blur them.
Right.
Because otherwise we get moire. And so
which is the devil.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes even after you blur it, some areas resist and still have moire, like even after you blur everything else. So normally the 11 by 17 600 dpi scans, the 8.5 by 11 600 dpi scans of the colors that I do, I blur it by 3 pixels or so, and that's usually enough. But there are some areas that need extra TLC, and I have to go and like select the area and just extra blur it. I've done it for funny purposes, like in the Sentry and stuff, but I don't like to add fake printing dots in my restorations of like Swamp Thing or anything like that. I did add fake newsprint color, but not printing dots. I just don't think that's, I mean, if you have the original printing dots and it's kind of like a facsimile, that's fine, but I am not into that. It's not, I mean, I don't mind other people doing it. It's just not me. Because the halftone thing in Photoshop doesn't really, it's an invention. It doesn't really do the,
doesn't resemble it at all. Yeah.
No.
And the angles are all wrong. The pitch is wrong. It's just a mess. Yeah. I've always been curious. I've never actually had the balls to do it. But I have been very tempted sometimes to tell the printer, please use the coarsest screen you can possibly use on this entire job, But the thing is, I don't have an extra few $1,000s to get wet proofs of the entire job and see it would look okay. But you could theoretically imagine something like that.
It may actually really harm the line art.
Right. Yeah. Well, you need to deliver the line art as a 1-bit high res image. Yeah. And then not have that trapped in with the rest of the color. But yeah, I'm tempted sometimes.
Well, this is something, Jose, that I was really, really excited about when you were posting some images of just like, hey, I recolored, my favorite page from Jack Kirby. This is what I think it should look like. And I was thinking, this is what I want when things are restored, because I had done just for shits and giggles, I had taken I got the Moon Knight Omnibus by Sienkiewicz, and the coloring in that is like, this is the color as it would have looked like, not desaturated by the print process, and they use that, and it's just absolutely awful. And so I had found just like
impossible to enjoy comics with those colors.
Oh, it's disgusting.
You feel like you're at a roller skate rink.
Yep.
Yeah.
Everything is.
But a lot of readers like them.
I don't get, but that's what there's this, and then there's this other group that wants to see the dots in everything because that's the nostalgia for them. And it's like, in my mind, what I want to see is exactly what you did, which is the colors desaturated as they would be by the print, but the line art actually like put together correct, and the colors printed very nice and flat. It's like, I think in the restoration process, and I'm curious to hear kind of your like ethics on this, that the goal isn't to get it to look exactly like it looked with the poor production materials of nostalgia. The effort should be to make it look as good as it possibly could had those people had the same kind of technology as us. But other people seem to want that nostalgia. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that kind of ethic.
I wrote about this. This is what happened. So when the pandemic began, I was on sabbatical, and I was in Madrid staying with my family. I had all these travel plans that had to be canceled. And instead, I found myself on sabbatical, which meant I had extra time for research. I was still coloring, of course, I'm always coloring. But because I wasn't teaching, I had all these projects that I had in mind that couldn't happen. So I don't know why, but I decided to start doing posts about coloring and about about reprints of mostly Silver Age and some Golden Age comics and how bad they normally look, and some that look really good too. But so I did this series called From a Colorist Perspective in Facebook, and I had a lot of fun with it. And a lot of people started to contribute, a lot of colorists that were using those old printing methods. There was so much information shared, and then professionals started to pitch in, and it was very, very fun. And I did over 400 posts, and I put a lot of information there. So then what happened was that, to my surprise, the collections editor for DC Comics asked me to do a reprint of Bernie Wrightson's Swamp Thing, which is one of my favorite comics of all times, and to use really to apply what I've been talking about. So here's the thing. I think that for coloring newsprint comics, my philosophy is the following. If you don't have original source, if you don't have original art, because it's been lost, like the majority of it has been lost or destroyed, because Stanley used to cross artwork with a marker or cut it in pieces and use it for, to put on their like cutting boards and stuff like that. So if you don't have the original art, then I believe the best thing to do is what Alan Harvey does, for example, who's a very fine restorer, which is scan the best copy that you can of the comic, compensate for the yellowing of the paper, compensate for the fading of some of the inks, fix coloring errors and registration errors, and if possible, print it on matte or semi-gloss paper, but not glossy, and if possible, print it with paper that is not screamingly white, that is slightly off-white. That can look very, very nice. And Alan has done some wonderful, he did a workbook with Atlas Comics, and he's just about to release another one. Peter Maresca, whom I love his restoration work. He's done, among many other things, the Big Little Nemo books from Sunday Press. He did a beautiful restoration of Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon for Titan. And he actually leaves little bits of like registration mistakes here and there. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't correct everything, but the work is just so beautiful that, I'd really, I think he's the gold standard as far as I'm concerned. Wonderful stuff. I feel that if you have the line art, like I did for Swamp Thing, either from more or less crisp printed black and white editions or from original art, from artist editions and so forth, and then to me, the best route is to recolor it, matching the colors. This also takes into consideration not using the color exactly like it looks in the page, because you have to take into consider, like, the newsprint is actually gray, it's not actually brown, but it does get brown real fast. So when the thing was just first printed, it had a tone of grayness, but the yellowness, that's from age, and it ages really fast. So take out that. So for example, some blue may look greenish, but it really was just blue. It's just that the yellow of the paper is making it look greenish. Take out that, try to match the color best possible. And one thing that I've seen that is terrible in reprints, when, you know, they get paid very little money to make these color separations. They do it in big studios. You know, there's one in India that does a lot of them. And it's a miracle they even do what they do, like, really honestly. But whenever you have two colors printed in newsprint, between the dots of the printing, the halftone printing, and the texture of the pulp paper, lines weren't hard. And many times they were not hard at all. They were very soft, depending. So those are normally interpreted as hard lines, like Photoshop hard lines, which looks terrible. So in Swamp Thing, one thing I did that, I don't know if people are, I guess people like you without paying attention would notice, is I actually did slight blending with texture in some, not in everywhere, but in some instances between the colors.
Right.
Not to mimic what the newsprint thing looked like, but to sort of reach the same effect of the fact
Provide
that
a transition area.
Provided a very small transition area, so it looks closer to what it looked in newsprint without actually putting the dots. It's actually, I use like paintedly dry brushes from Photoshop, but I never even used the same one. I kept repeating, I kept trying new ones to see what happened. I had to color the whole thing, all 300 pages, like, they gave me less than 4 weeks. I was like, it was insane. I had to like cancel plans. I kept catching myself making mistakes. Like, it was just really, I mean, it's fun.
Right.
I had a blast. But I like to work. I work fast, but not that fast. And I like to work with a little bit more time. But, you know, I don't know if it was because it was a last minute decision to do it this way. You know, I never really got an explanation, but I'm glad they did. And I'm super happy with the printed edition. Yeah, I wanted matte paper, and so did the editors, but due to supply issues right now, supply shortages, there wasn't any, like, I wanted V for Vendetta, you know, absolute kind of paper, but that's just not available. So the semi-gloss that they use is really nice. I thought it looked really good.
Yeah, paper.
I see that now that, you know,
I said paper shortages are a real bummer right now.
Oh yeah.
Well, it was interesting to hear you talk about, you know, some of your decision making processes in there, and especially like you said that about leaving some of the registration issues. One of the things that I've thought a lot about aesthetically about a page like that is when you start, if there are other aesthetic issues already with the printing, taking away or massaging out the edges on one area starts to draw attention to the other problems. So it's like if the page is already kind of printed poorly and you're reproducing it from there, you know, and you shore up the blacks, but the yellow is still blown out on, you know, part of the plate where it was a misimpression or something like that. It almost seems like correcting all of the registration starts to draw undue emphasis towards those other flaws, you know? It strikes me that that's a sort of painterly sort of concern. You're working on a painting and it doesn't quite look right. You don't know why. And it's like, oh, because I only use that color right down here and not over here. You know, you start buffing away buffing away the edges on the rendering, and then you notice that your drawing's not any good, right? There's all these sort of like art aesthetic considerations that you're bringing into to bear on.
Yes, I normally correct those auto registration things, but sometimes they really work with the art. For example, you may have a shape and it's colored with something, and the plate shifted a little bit, so you have a little bit of a lighter color contour,
Right.
And that can actually give it volume, even if it's unintentional. So I would clean off the extra from the dark side, and I would leave the highlight on the part, and it would look, it would make it look nicer. But yeah, I mean, it's not like applying a filter or using a robot. It's a lot of like guesswork. And if I did it over, I would probably do it differently, but not because just because I don't remember what I did. So, it's just, there's a lot of guesswork and taste. So like, what kind of taste do you have,
Yeah, I remember the first time that I even really considered any of these issues. Someone brought up ukiyo-e prints, Japanese multicolor prints, woodcuts, and basically there was an argument. Someone just saying, well, why do they ever recolor anything? Like, would you recolor a woodcut print? Would you take a hokusai, and just strip out the black plate and recolor it? And it's an intriguing kind of question to sort of reach across, culturally and also across a century. Like, because of course, if you had the black plate still, maybe you would. Right.
Well, this is the thing. Hokusai, I don't know enough, but I am assuming that either he did his own coloring himself or he had a number of technicians assisting him to make the plates. As you well know, that didn't happen in comics. Like, artists had very little control over what colors were applied to their art. And to treat it in the same context as a fine art print by Hokusai is a mistake. Because there are exceptions. For example, it's just been discovered not long ago that the amazing color that everybody assumed was by Winsor McCay in Little Nemo was actually done by a colorist who was like an absolute genius of color, and he colored other strips as well. And I don't know how much direct input, I imagine a lot, McCay had in them, but those are not his colors. And Winston, and Little Nemo, one of the things that people admired in addition to the inventiveness is the absolutely drop dead gorgeous use of color. So, but that was in comic strips, which were a lot more control, where the artists, like Hal Foster would do color guides, blah, 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 that was different. But in comic books were treated like trash. They're just like, in and out, like, like there was absolutely no sense of ownership of the finished product, and the companies kept it that way. I wrote a lot. I run in Facebook. I made a group for Lou Fine and Mac Raboy because I feel that people don't talk enough about them. And for those of you who never heard those names, they were really amazing draftsmen that work in early comics for a few years, then they moved to comic strips and then retired. They were highly admired at the time, but have been largely forgotten, mostly because they never really created commercial characters of note.
Well, Mac Raboy did Flash Gordon after Alex Raymond, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. And Lou Fine moved into like realistic comics after comic strips after that. So Mac Raboy, in his covers, which were very famous at the time, you can totally see that he colored them himself. It's super obvious because there is a lot of drawing done with the color. And it's beautiful. And it's subtle. All those Captain Marvel Jr. and a lot of stuff for Fawcett, just gorgeous, subtle coloring. Lou Fine, on the other hand, worked for a lesser publisher. And rumor has it that the editor-in-chief was colorblind. So he demanded extremely, extremely bright colors all over all the covers. Will Eisner was working for him, and Lou Fine was working in Eisner's studio.
Right.
So you look at those covers, and the color is absolutely hideous. It totally overwhelms the very, very delicate art that Lufine did. And I'm sure he had absolutely no way to control it. So nostalgia is, in my opinion, nostalgia is the biggest disease in the comics industry.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that all of us have a little bit of it, but you have to keep it under watch because it can really cloud your judgment. I mean, I tell you, because I teach, I'm always showing comics to my students all the time. I have never, ever, ever, ever been able to get any of my students interested, much less excited about Jack Kirby.
It took me like I'm only now becoming interested in Jack Kirby, honestly, because I didn't grow up with him, and it took me a long time to see it.
You know, they're like, yeah, it's really important. Oh, show me that thing by, you know, Frank Whiteley or Alex Ross or whoever.
Yeah,
you know, but like, or old stuff. Like I showed them like Jesus Blasco will have a lot of, you know, steel claw pages, and they go crazy over that stuff.
Yeah.
But like Jack Kirby, they're like, absolute indifference is the best way I can describe it. It's not that they dislike it. It's just like, and you're showing us this because. So I think that's same thing with Will Eisner. They're like, oh, plus, you know, I don't really show it very much anyways because of Ebony and stuff.
Right.
Like, it's so problematic.
Yeah.
So yeah, nostalgia is bad. So, you know, out of morbid curiosity, I went to the message boards when I was when something was coming out, and everybody there has an opinion, and a lot of people were detractors because they love the right reprints, or they know how they would do it, and
yeah,
everything else is wrong. And I was like viciously insulted as being a nostalgic baby that couldn't give up my blah 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 blah. And I was like, okay.
What did they want? I mean, to me, when they did the absolute Swamp Thing at Alan Moore's run, and they went and did those new digital colors on it, it's like, what in the hell is this? This is, and to me, it's not nostalgia. It's just
it's the aesthetic.
It
brutality.
Well, there was a lot of like all of a sudden there was so much controversy about the fact that I used that base of since I knew it couldn't be printed in off-white paper, I used the base. I scanned sheets of brand new newsprint and I overlay all the pages with brand new, different, not the same sheet, but different sheets of.
Yeah.
And they were like, let's mix the colors dirty, mix the color this. I mean, this is a lot of like, it doesn't look like my copy. Well, I don't know how your copy was printed. Like, I mean, I have several copies of each one of those comics, not two look alike. Like major differences, especially in the covers, like major differences, depending on where they fell in the print run. But I'm not going to explain that to people. It's like, whatever, don't buy it.
Yeah. It's a very interesting thing. Like there are people who feel like something needs to be modern, like there are some type of signpost that tells them, don't worry, you have bought a new thing instead of an old thing, right? And then there are people who want the signpost that says, don't worry, this thing is still dirty the way you like it, right? There's extremes to this kind of disease.
Well, you know, this is one thing that this is very and it's very typical of comics, and it's comics are different from other industries because basically everyone involved in comics is a fan.
Yeah.
So the boundaries between fans and professionals sometimes get blurred or just stumped over. So anybody who reads comics feels like they can go up to Jim Lee and tell him what's wrong with his art. And they do.
Yeah.
Or they can just post a long diatribe about why they don't like Alex Ross's paintings or whatever. And it's like, okay, whatever. Or they tell people how they should do, what they should do, how they should do it. Like they're like, that's wrong. I mean, we all can have our own taste. There is room for criticism in comics. I am guilty as charged of being very critical. But, you know, there is a very huge distance between working professionally and just reading comics. And I feel that it is just not malicious. It's completely out of, it has, you know, fans that are overbearing with their opinion. They're not trying to harm anybody. They're just very passionate, but it becomes extremely offensive. So I just block them.
Well, I mean,
like, unsolicited advice in social media for me is like block.
You know, I figured out.
I can see what I can see why the people have the passion about certain kinds of things, especially when you get into aesthetic realms where. Carson showed me. I had never seen. I had never read the Ink Call before until about a year ago, and after having read the Ink Call and just being blown away by, you know, obviously Mobius's art and the coloring, incredible, beyond reproach, right? And the applique, everything about it just lets the line art do all of the work, right? And then you see the recoloring job that he did. I had never seen it before. Carson showed me some. You know, some stills from it, and the person who charged with doing this, I'm sorry, I'm sorry in advance. The person charged with doing this has added all this modeling that is, I don't think ruining is too strong a word, in the sense that if this was the only version of the book going forward, anyone who read it would not have an aesthetic experience that is not similar remotely to the previous experience that somebody had. And so it seems like that's I think there are edge cases where someone has changed the intention of the work.
Over rendered, but it went from all of those bright psychedelic colors to like brown and gray, gloomy, you know. I don't know, Jose,
So
if you've seen what we're talking about.
Of course, of course, I wrote about it. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, of course. But
Okay.
this is the thing. Okay. And this is what people forget, including us.
Okay.
I bought the original Inkle when it came out. I love those pastel saturated colors. They look beautiful. They were flat, which I love. I love
Right.
flat color. I have a big bias for that, especially in Moebius. Blah, blah, blah. When it was color, I was like, ugh. But the person who colored it is actually an artist who's very, very, very skilled, and who's done like other Meta Baron stuff with Jodorowsky that looks amazing. Very photorealistic, but very, very well done. So it wasn't some hack they found on the street. It was a really talented artist. What he did with those pages is exactly what he was told to do.
Mm-hmm.
To use his own palette, which is very gray, to put a lot of glossy rendering, which he does in his own work. And it was not that he was making all those decisions because he thought the work needed it, is that he was hired for a job and he was doing his job and he did what he was told to do.
Yeah.
And so when we judge the colorists, we're paying a big disservice to very talented people, including, you know, people that I know, or myself sometimes. I do some colors sometimes I just don't like, but it's like what I'm being told to do.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't mean they're using their own judgment with aesthetics. And this is commercial work. This is not a fine art project.
So the artist you're referring to is Fred Beltran, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't be critical. I think when we're being critical of those things, what we're being critical of is the corporate kind of making that decision to hire Fred Beltran, because what they were trying to do at the point was trying to make the Ink Call visually sit better in the rest of the Meta Baron's universe. And I think Fred Beltran coming out with the Megalex stuff being real popular at the time, they're like, okay, now apply that aesthetic to Ink Call. And so my criticism isn't of him, because the Megalex stuff is awesome. It's amazing. It's of that corporate decision to like, well, we got to make this more sellable for 2001 or whenever they did that.
Or the general mentality of this needs to be new, this needs to be shiny, you know, there's this sort of
Yeah, it has to fit within the aesthetic that we're trying to publish. I recently did some covers for a company that shall remain unnamed with an artist that shall remain unnamed.
very
And
smart.
you know, and I have my own philosophy about covers. So, and also, like when I look at a work in black and white, I sort of picture what kind of colors go with it. So, but definitely for a cover, as opposed to an interior page, I tend to use brighter colors always, because I wanted to jump at the reader always. And so I did several covers, and then I was like art directed to tone everything down, to make everything very muted. And then when I would make everything muted, the art, which was very complex, would just blend and flatten, and nothing stood out from nothing. So I was doing like rim light and all kinds of tricks, and it was, I just got copies the other day. I was like, oof. Now, with the same artist, I just did a huge project with super saturated colors, and he's over the moon. So I told him, you know, those were in my colors. And it's like, I know. So, I mean, they're professional, but they're not what I would do. So, you know, I think people don't know how much responsibility. I mean, sometimes I get compliments for things that I didn't really intend to be that way. I've even been nominated for awards for things that I didn't really agree with the colors I was using. So, but I just say thank you, and that's it. Just like when people want me to sign things I haven't colored, I just say thank you and I sign it.
Smart. Yeah.
I'm not going to embarrass anybody, you know.
Yeah.
I used to be like, I'm sorry, I didn't color in humans, and there's like, oh, so sorry. It's like, no, just there's a lot of copies of humans that I signed.
Oh, they just assumed because it was like what he did after Hell Shop that you were on it. That's pretty
Yeah,
funny.
because, you know, Jay wanted me to color in humans, but Marvel would absolutely not think about it, because he was told my work was too artistic. So yeah.
Well, I mean, that's what made it though. That's what made it so great. I think so, like what going to the nostalgia thing, I think the reason I got interested in all of this is working on The Strange Death of Alex Raymond. I had always dismissed, and this is where I think that instead of nostalgia, I see it as an ethical responsibility to try and recover as much of the original state of the art as possible, because I had always dismissed Alex Raymond because I'd always seen poor reproductions of his art. And like I'm reading these really, really well done reproductions of Terry and the Pirates that
You mean
Clover.
not Alex Raymond, but
Oh no, both. I had dismissed
Both.
Alex Raymond, and then now I'm looking at also Milt Caniff's Terry and the Pirates, and even there where they don't have the original art, I still look at it and I say this guy's not that good. And I dismissed Raymond as such as well because I'd only ever seen poor reproductions. And then when you start seeing the what was actually there, it's like, oh, my evaluation of this artist changes. And I think a lot of artists, it's just too easy to dismiss them because of the reproduction that was done at the time, which is where I get really hesitant about the nostalgia for the way it looked then. It's like you just don't actually like the person who's nostalgia for the old newsprint crappy reproduction, they still don't understand how good that artist really is potentially because they haven't seen the original state. So that's where I'm coming at it from.
There's even a certain
go ahead.
Oh, there's even a certain randomness to it. I mean, you know, Raymond's style didn't hold up to that multi-generation deterioration as well as, you know, Caniff. I mean, Caniff looks like Caniff because he's using these big chunky things. You know what I mean? He holds up better.
We were very fortunate to have the Library of American Comics from IDW, and they have done a remarkable job with Caniff and with Raymond. I was talking before about the Maresca Titan restorations of Flash Gordon, but I think that, I don't know who was the restorer, but the IDW Library of American Comics Jungle Gym Flash Gordon are beautiful as well. So I think that generally speaking, with comic strips, things are 100% better than with comic books, like including the restorations and the reprints. Like, I mean, it makes sense in some ways because to be a comic strip artist, as you know, with a syndicated comic was extremely prestigious. To be a comic book artist was the least prestigious. So that's why so many comic book artists really try to get into the field. And some, like I was saying before, Lou Fine and Mac Raboy, once they got into syndication, they never looked back. So I think that the level of care that, you know, classic comic strips like, you know, Crazy Cat and stuff like that have been treated with, compared with classic comics, there's just no comparison. Nobody would recolor Crazy Cat and put like insane saturated colors.
I think they do really well with the Sundays, but the dailies, because the art was still, I don't know, it wasn't kept, like they're still working from pretty bad like negatives.
Or the dailies is like, that's just, talk about archaeology. You know, you have to find it from so many different sources, and some of it painted really horribly. So, but the level of care, even when the final result is not optimal, it's remarkable. And I wish that a fraction of that was applied. We haven't talked about the Taschen $200 books, photographed and printed and all that stuff.
I'm very curious what you're, you know.
Well, I haven't seen them like in person. I read all about them. I'm certainly not going to buy them. But I think what they are doing is interesting from a bibliophile sort of point of view. I know that there's this English company, you know, the ones that do all the beautiful illustrated books. They took the same approach. One right over there. There's an English company that's also done like $150 reprints of Marvel characters. And I'm open to appreciating them. I mean, certainly, if, you know, if they weren't so prohibitive, I would think about perhaps checking them out. Okay, I have a confession to make. They reprinted Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and Avengers. I'm not the biggest fan of those runs. I know it's like anathema. I respect them more than like them.
Right.
And so I feel that I never even liked them when I was little. I mean, I was so happy when John Romita started making the characters beautiful in Spider-Man. I didn't even know why, because they had no credits, but the women were beautiful all of a sudden, and it was glamorous, and Peter didn't look insane. And May didn't look like a monster anymore. So I was so happy. But
I always thought it was possible Aunt May might eat Peter at any given second.
I had no credit. No, they had no credits, but I definitely was like, oh, thank God. And I remember so well, like when Avengers, like after suffering through innumerable issues of Don Heck, when John Buscema took over, I was like, oh my God, thank God, this is beautiful. So, you know, I started like, I was just not even nostalgia. I just didn't like that stuff. I like, you know, John Buscema, Neil Adams, Gene Colan. I like John Romita. I like slightly more glamorous artists like Kirby and Ditko. So if they were like things that I really care about, maybe I would check them out. But, you know, I'm glad they're doing it. And Taschen being Taschen, I hope that they will do a trade edition in a foreseeable future, because they're infinitely better than the reprints that Marvel puts out, of course. The only thing that Marvel did that is very decent is this Weapon X thing.
Yes, that's gorgeous.
And that's like, you know, Barry Windsor Smith had very eloquently written about what was wrong with the previous recolors. And he, I think that he was pleased with this because I put a good review of it and he put like in Facebook. So I think, but you know, I think the paper is nice. The colors are good. Sometimes they get a little saturated, but it's okay. You know, it's not perfect is the enemy of good.
Right.
Yeah.
So certainly it's like a million times better than anything that Marvel has done before. And it has things that I'm just glad I wasn't restoring this.
Yeah, the wild colors.
The
Oh my.
original
And-
colors were quite successful, and especially from a narrative standpoint. I mean, they
I love the
carry-
original colors, but you know, to restore this, it would be like it would give me like a headache because it has to be right. And he did this, but you know, things like you know, my little pet peeves like the coloring of the hair with the white highlight with the
Yeah.
hard edges. That's
Right.
like a shape floating it. And you look at the comic, it would blend in.
Right.
You know, that kind of thing. I have one of the comics here. As a matter of fact.
and he has such a wild color palette that he makes look
Oh,
natural
insane.
somehow. It's amazing.
Yeah, like you know, if you look at the original comic, which is beautifully colored, but the colors have faded a little bit, and the
Yeah.
paper is yellow. So this
Right.
takes that into consideration, which I think is the right direction, and I think that was very, very successful in terms of like, it's a little bit more slick than you know my Swamp Thing, but you know it's really, really, really good.
Yeah, that was the,
You know,
the best thing.
He was
I've
very
seen.
good at using white for highlights and things like that. You know, but you can see it here that, well, I don't know if you can see it here, but the colors blend because they have the, you know, the texture of the paper plus the texture of the dots.
Yeah.
So anyway,
So it's got a little bit of like tooth on the edge that you were trying to recreate.
exactly.
He's another person similar to that period of Mobius, where when there's over rendered color, and there are plenty of examples. I don't need to name the publishers who have gotten his catalog of his '70s stuff. When there's over rendered color on top of that, it makes it look crude in a way that the original drawings don't. It's a
Right.
very interesting effect.
Yeah, it's like coloring Jack Kirby three-dimensionally. It's a mistake.
Yeah.
It's
And there-
it's a cartoonist, and they should be colored flat, two-tone stops. That's it.
One of the things that's cool in that Weapon X that Jose just held up is they have a couple recolored covers in the back where you see like the modern doorknob coloring on the same cover, and you're like, oh my god, you know, it makes it really obvious what the two approaches are.
Carson and I generally
again,
call
it's
it doorknob
editorial.
coloring because it makes everything look like a doorknob, you know, because you have a perfect gradation as it fades away from the imaginary light source. But everything
true.
is a doorknob simultaneously.
It's true.
I think we came to that because I said when I was a kid, Whilce Portacio's Wetworks was like the best coloring I'd ever seen, but it made sense for that because they were like doorknob people running around with big guns. So,
Everyone is metal.
yeah,
Well,
they were
you
like
know,
made
as
out
I
of metal.
said, you know, that's the editor's choice. It's not the colorist's choice.
Yeah,
And you know, and then the artist, if they have to say, you know, I color Barry once and he didn't really like what I did. So it's like if you don't have input from the artist and the editor's giving you a certain direction, my goal normally is to get both input from the artist, the writer, and the artist. Like I want everyone to be happy, but sometimes they want contradictory things. And ultimately the editor is the one who pays for the work. So he has the final say. But, you know, I think that the color, when it's not the same, I mean, those color guides were done by Barry Smith. Nobody else could have done it like that. But when it's somebody else putting your color sense into it, we're just there to complement the art and to a certain degree the story as well. So, and to please the publisher. So, you know, there's a very accommodating side of the coloring industry that when people think about us in a more auteur sort of way, that's just not the case. The only thing is like they make whole one of us instead of somebody else because they want a certain look that we did before or something.
yeah.
but that's the only thing, you know.
When you're doing someone like Barry Windsor Smith, who has a like kind of way that he does it and has a studio of people that he trained to do it his way, do you try and like pick up cues from his aesthetic, or you go, well, they hired me to do my thing?
With Barry, I only did one, and it was an unusually drawn cover, and I felt like it needed actually some pizzazz, which I know he didn't like, but I did paint it first. I painted it with watercolors first, but then it became pretty digital, which I think is what he objected to, and I'm not surprised because that's just not him. Yes, of course, you know, when I color Corben, I totally look at Corben palettes and Corben rendering. He actually did a tutorial for me when I did Cage and sent it to me. When I colored Sienkiewicz, I was totally looking at Sienkiewicz. When I color artists that work in color, I pay very close attention to their work. And then some of the artists that I'm best known for never work in color or extremely limited color, like Paul Pope, Jeff Lemire, Jay Lee. They never do their own color. And so then it's about finding what kind of colors they're going to like with their work, and how to do that kind of rendering that they're going to ask for.
That seems like it must be a very, like, when you're given someone there's not a predefined style, that seems like a really big challenge. What are some of the cues that you look at in the black and white that suggest an approach to color? Like, this person I'm going to do flat, this person I'm going to do more painterly, this person I'm going to do with gradients.
Normally my instinct always tells me to keep it simple. I remember Ryan Suk, the first time that I colored something for him, he said, keep the colors flat, and I did them 100% flat, and he was shocked because he said nobody had ever done that, and I was like, really? So then he asked me to color X Factor for him. To me, the basic rule of the thumb is the more stylized the work is, the simpler and flatter the color. The more realistic, the more detail you can put. It's just like the art. If the art has a lot of detail, you can put detail in the coloring. If the art is very simple, don't put the detail in the coloring because that's not going to help it. If the art is very detailed and the color is very simple, it can actually sort of look like an afterthought as opposed to a real part of the art. And then I really try to mimic, for example, when an artist does certain kinds of shapes for shadows, like serrated edges or whatever, I try to do the same thing for highlights. You know, I try to sort of, like, the first thing I did with Corben was Cage, and he was using a different style when he started to work for Marvel that he'd never done before, and everything was like pointillist. He was doing like teeny dots. I got the pages to scan, and I was like, holy cow. So I put all the colors with little teeny dots, which I think he was okay with, but he told me to tone it down a little bit, and I did. But I was just completely trying to follow like a continuation of the drawing. I mean, the way I see it oftentimes is that ideally what the colorist does is finish the pages. And all of the leads should be taken from the art itself. Light sources, mood, you know, kinds of shapes, amount of detail, all that stuff should be from the art itself and not imposed on the art. And I think that it helps if you're able to draw a lot. Yeah. It helps if you're able to paint, and you know, how much facility you have in like adding painted elements to things, you know. But the other thing is that I never overthink it. I mean, I'm articulating a lot of things right now that I haven't thought about in my life because I just, you know, basically you do it instinctively. And if you have drawing and painting experience, not comic book coloring experience, but drawing and painting experience, it just knows ways to resolve things that make sense. And I found that painting in natural media like watercolor, acrylics, and oils translated instantaneously to working in Photoshop or Painter. Like there was no, actually, I feel like I've become a better painter in physical materials through all the work I've done in Photoshop. Like I see a difference now when I work with physical materials to how I used to be. I'm a lot more like what I wanted to be. I was really uptight, and now I'm not. So I think that both things permeate in each other in a way that it's very positive.
I still think about painting in terms of Photoshop layers. Like I used Photoshop before I painted, but when I got to painting and I started learning about glazing and stuff, I immediately was like, oh, this is like a multiply layer, or this is like a normal layer, but with the opacity down. And it really benefited me.
Well,
Sorry,
because I was a painter before any of this, I use very few layers. I use very few, like, I don't use adjustment layers. I don't use channels for separate information. I try to work on 1 or 2 layers, like if it was a painting. And I keep it simple. I like to keep, I mean, I have underneath I have a layer for flats, but then I have a color layer, and that's pretty much where I do everything. But that's very different from people that I know, illustrators in particular, that don't do it like that, that have like 100 layers in each piece, because each area is separated as its own layer with its own name and all that stuff. That's kind of impossible in comics because you have to like churn it out really fast. So if you start labeling everything, you'll never get it done. But it's also my nature to just like paint it. And the way I teach the students is just like, make up your mind. Don't have everything open with a million different choices. You can always go back and you can always, go to a previous version or save different versions of it or whatever, but don't keep everything in a million layers because you're not sure. However, that is a losing battle because my students are all working on Procreate now, and they just do it their own way. They have a gazillion layers in Procreate. They may take a lot longer to do it. It's their own learning curve.
I'm curious about your one thought process thing that I wanted to ask you about is when you're conceptualizing a story from the beginning, you have all the art laid out, someone has delivered this to you. How are you deciding between, like, say, narrative use of color or locale based, like every scene is going to have, its own palette, or local color or extreme lighting? Like, are those decisions that you're making on a sort of meta level, looking at the whole story, or are you approaching that?
Yes.
Okay.
What I do normally is oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes what I do is I color everything literally with local color. That's particularly important when you're doing characters that have uniforms. I mean, not superheroes, but like Sweet Tooth or whatever. I color everything literally, like all 22 pages or whatever. And then I decide on different colors for different sequences, depending on the time of the day, etc. So then I would make everything bluish, or everything purplish, or everything orangey in something, with overlays,
Right.
And then I decide where the subjective color should go, where it's like the little climaxes in the story, and then I accentuate those, usually with complementary colors. If I have a blue scene, I would put an orange background. Red is very handy for that. White is very handy for that. But you cannot abuse it. You have to use it sparingly. Sometimes the editor wants subjective color everywhere for some jobs. And like, even though they're in the same locale, one panel has a blue background, the next one has a green background. It's like, whatever. But I wouldn't do it myself like that unless I'm being asked to do it that way. So basically, it's like literal color as a base, and then sequences that when you put them like in, I use bridge a lot, and when you put them together, you can totally see where one sequence begins and ends, and then accents in certain parts to really bring out those moments that you think are critical or that are described in the story as critical.
I'm going to steal everything that you just said and put it on my wall so that I have a goal for next time. That's a fantastic.
Well, this is the thing is that, when you have like, and I don't do a lot of superhero comics anymore, but when I've done like group teams and stuff like that, like X-Men or Avengers and stuff like that. All of those characters have super bright color costumes. Those colors, if you just do the literal color, they look terrible together.
Right.
That's one of the things about reprints. When you put those colors saturated together, they just crash with each other. But if you color everything literally with local color, and then you put an overlay at 20%, 25% of any color, of red or blue or green, or even like something with a gradient, the colors are still going to look like the colors that they're supposed to be, but they actually mysteriously are going to look like they belong together because you put a glaze of another color on top. And you can even put a glaze of a random color and then go to image adjust variation and change the hue. And then sometimes when I'm not sure what to do, I do that and it's like, hey, it looks really good. It's purple.
Spin the wheel. This is what
You
this is what I used to call spin the wheel with the client who couldn't decide on a color. Yeah.
And then
5 versions.
you don't see it. You don't see purple everywhere, but everything has been toned down with purple or with whatever color. And it's basically the equivalent of like putting like a light that has a little bit of a tint, illuminating that scene with a little bit of a tint that pulls all those colors together. And I do that almost without thinking. Mm-hmm. I just tick, 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 you know? But yeah, that I find very useful. And that's a way to do a sequence too. Just pick a color and then put that overlay in every frame in that, you know?
Right.
So I'm going to steal the bridge thing because that's kind of like what we've been talking about having all the pages up on a paperclip on the wall. We've been talking a lot about just meta composition throughout a book and how people manage that, and that's a really good idea.
So anybody who doesn't know what we're talking about, Adobe Bridge enables you to see several different folder full of files simultaneously.
Yeah.
Or you could do this. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Very smart. Well, Jose, you've been talking to us for quite a while here, and we really appreciate it. And
well,
the technical stuff that you were worried about is exactly the kind of thing that we're super into, and so we really
I'm glad, you know, because I never talk about these things, but I'm just very very aware that most people, unless they know Photoshop really well and a little bit of color theory, it's really opaque to follow what we're discussing. But you know, if your followers like this stuff, I love talking about it, obviously. And you know, and I think that I don't even post things like this online because I try to make everything very general audience when I do social media postings. So I think that it is you know, I feel that there's a shift right now. As I said before, the students are using Procreate. I have Procreate. I play with it. It's fantastic for sketching because the responsiveness to the pen and so forth. But I feel like to do the coloring for comics in the way that it just seems problematic for me at this point. It doesn't mean that he can't do it, but I would have to reinvent the wheel to do it. And I mean, I have an old version of Photoshop and I'm perfectly happy with it. So I think that the versatility of Photoshop, the fact that I can do mainstream coloring, alternative coloring, and restore people as different as Bernie Wrightson or Richard Corben, it's just, to me, Photoshop still is king when it comes to like image making, 2D image making software.
It seems like, oh, sorry. It seems like,
no.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, that may change because everything changes all the time. But I think that it suits my purposes for the time being.
What I've noticed with the Procreate is that it seems to work better for the kids who, like, more and more people are doing it all themselves now, and they build an illustration style that's like ground up, and the Procreate seems really good for people who work that way, where their line art is colored from the get-go, and that seems to be the benefit of Procreate. You could do that in Photoshop, but
yeah, but for, you know, but it's just actually it's easier in Procreate because the response time is better. It has really great brushes. It has a lot of features that Photoshop doesn't have. It's completely intuitive. Photoshop has a lot of junk.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, 90% of what Photoshop does, I could just delete it if I could edit it because I'm never going to use it in my life.
Yeah.
So Photoshop is loaded with tricks and crap that are useless. I think that Procreate is a much leaner, meaner, practical program that doesn't have crap in it. And that's something Photoshop should really consider in future releases, to do something more economical that really suits illustration better, as opposed to all these 3D tools and crap that it has. That's like, who cares?
It is amazing that for years and years, I only did coloring in a program called Paint Tool Sci that a Japanese gentleman developed by himself, probably in a couple afternoons. And the handling of the wet media brushes in that is still not anywhere near, it's never been matched by Photoshop. And this is a program that's been out since, I don't even remember, 2006 or something like that, and it's a tiny program. It's like a 2 megabyte program. And it's like this tiny 2 megabyte program that you can put on a flash disk and carry around with you has paint handling techniques that Photoshop, it doesn't. And it must just be a marketing, they don't see a reason to develop that side of it. But
well, I think they're maximalist in their approach to like software. And I think that, they did, to the credit, Photoshop came up with a really user-friendly architecture, so you can really learn it intuitively for the most part. Programs like Painter never had. That was like, it was atrociously hard to, even dabble in it. So, but I feel like they stopped evolving at some point, and then other people are. I have students that use Clip Studio, and it just feels like other students have taken the baton and have kept going. And I think Adobe is just, I feel, is like, it's establishment, it's old-fashioned, it's not innovative when it comes to software, and the innovations that they do just seem completely arbitrary or unnecessary, in my opinion.
Yeah. And the thing, Procreate too, the first time I saw a student use it, I was like, is that a vector program or a raster program? Like, they stretch things around like vectors, but then in the end, and they'll snap and like smooth and all these things that I really, really wish the Adobe would put into Photoshop in a more fluid way.
Absolutely. They must be noticing that if you can buy a program with the stupid subscription program that they have, or you can pay $10 and have something for life. Why would anyone pay a subscription if they don't have it for free from Google?
Unless you're trapped like me and you have too many legacy files that are active, I feel trapped by it. I could replace Photoshop with I can't even remember the name of it. It starts with an A, and I'm going to remember it as soon as we get off the call, and has the word photo in the title. But InDesign, but the functionality between InDesign and scripting all of the actions that I've written over an 8-year period that I use on different books, I would have to re-script all of those things in a new platform if I switched over. So, they have me by the balls,
I hear you. And I think for the longest time, I refused to subscribe. So I was using CS3 until relatively recently, until it just didn't work with my computer anymore. So I still wish I could use one of those old ones, because nothing that has happened in the last 15 years in Photoshop, has multiple undos. That was like, once they put the history palette in it, it's like, that's it. I don't need anything else, And so, I think that a lot of people, I was reading Carla Ortiz just did, because of the whole AI thing that she's involved in. She just did a new painting, incorporating some kind of software that makes it not, it cannot be sample for, creating AI images. But she did it in traditional media, and then she said she finished it up with her very old version of Photoshop. And I was like, I think most professionals that actually do a lot of work don't have the latest version because they don't need it.
Yeah.
And I think we tend to have the oldest one until it stops working, and because of the operating system and stuff like that.
Yeah.
What do you guys think about the whole AI thing? Like, let me
You're getting
you.
into deep territory there, man.
Carson is responsible for what is probably most likely the first entirely AI illustrated comic. This was back in June of last year.
Oh, you're the Carson who did that Legacy
Abolition
of
of
Man.
Man.
Yeah, Abolition of Man.
Yeah,
You're
yeah,
that Carson. I was like,
Yep.
your name sounds so familiar.
yeah. That's
Yes,
yeah.
yes. Oh, of course. So this is like a loaded question for sure.
Yeah,
We-
we've been
so you-
on that since June and talking to all kinds of people about it, and
we just felt like we were shouting into nothing for a while there because no one, but it became clearer, I think, as time has gone on what the end result is going to be.
what we were shouting about. Yeah. The thing that I've come to at the end of it all, I don't know, they just released version 4 of Midjourney yesterday, and holy
Five.
yeah, 5,
Because
sorry.
it has
5.
because it does 5 fingers.
Oh yeah, oh my God.
That's the innovation. It does 5 fingers now.
Yeah. It's just the progress is astonishing. I think initially we were both like, we were using it to cry about why it should be killed. But in using it, honestly, I have become such a significantly better artist when I'm working without it, because of the lessons I've learned from it, that I have a hard time like poo-pooing on it now. And I think the really, people who are good artists who don't get scared of it will learn something from it and will be able to integrate it in a way that pushes things forward. And I think it's going to lead to, which was always, I mean, I've been talking about this for 20 years. I've had this term, a banal content apocalypse. That's my fear, is that there's just so much content being produced. Like you can pretty much, you could just put it on automatic and have it produce every possible image ever, and then we could just walk away and be done. And that bothers me, that like endless automatic content. But
Endless
for us
empty
artists,
content.
for us artists that, like, use it or don't, I don't know that it's definitely a threat to jobs, but I don't know that it's the existential threat I thought it was at first.
I lost a job 2 months ago, a month and a half ago, to a client who told me that my ink drawing with flat color looked like it was generated. And they had lined me up to do illustrations for a podcast that they do, a weekly podcast. And I sent them this ink drawing, which is done with a giant Suma-e brush, really, really quickly. And it's like a 5-minute, like, and then flat color on top. And they said that looks generated. And I just be like, plead with them, like, hey, look, I'll do a watercolor wash instead. How does this look? And they were like, okay, that works. But this is going to be the norm, as people will look for tells, especially with like clients, like, a lot of businesses. Like I'm a low level illustrator who works with businesses who want some kind of prestige for it. Their idea of hiring something like this is that it not just that it looks nice, it looks like they spent money on it. And that perception over time shifts as something becomes more and more available. So anyone working in a style that is easily imitable by a machine is going to be shit out of luck when, what they produce is seen as easily accessible, let's say. You could imagine some temporary short run in which someone who draws in a really crude kind of fashion is suddenly, more in demand because the polish has, it's pushed out all the polished people. But I think everything is imitable by the machine. it's going to be able to imitate anything. And so, you know, it's not us who have already gained the skills that I'm continue to be worried about. It's the people who, like my kids, who are going to grow up with this at the critical juncture where somebody decides, like, hey, am I going to push hard enough to get past my childish drawings and get to my adult drawings? I mean, what percentage of those people are just going to be sucked into just instant gratification?
Interesting. Well, I couldn't have asked a better question from you.
Yeah.
Everyone on our channel is sick of us talking about it, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
you
you're
know, Carson, when you did the comic, that's like around the same time Dave McKeon did his, which they had in San Diego last year, and I think that that was like early Midjourney with all its virtues and, you know, challenges. The imagery was very new then, so it was very startling. And then it's become cliche to some degree because you know, the sort of stylistic limitations that it had in the beginning, which are less and less as they keep expanding and incorporating art styles. I'm very curious about it. I've been warning my colleagues at MICA, where I teach, to be on the lookout, not with Midjourney, but with Wombo art from the iPhone, because it can do like reasonably decent. Oh my God, it does you raise your hand, it reads.
Yeah, it's not doing it for me. You just
Our
have like
all shift simultaneously.
the AI has read your hand. It's learning.
I
5
tell
fingers.
you, it has 5 fingers. Yeah, it does it every time.
Yeah.
I was telling other faculty, like, look out just in case a student tries to sneak in one of these like digital landscapes for one of the assignments. Once Midjourney and Stable Diffusion exploded, then I was like, okay, we really have to be like, first we have to get to know what this is, and then we really have to like see what it can and cannot do at this point, knowing that it's going to change almost every month.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So basically, I showed examples to my department. They were shocked. They weren't aware of it. And then all the student groups are on Discord. That's where they meet. That's where they hang out.
Yeah.
So I was like, I need to put information in the syllabus about not turning in artwork done in Midjourney or anything else like that, but to do it by hand. So I wrote very specific language about not using it to do classwork. However, I understand they're playing with it, and I'm 100% fine with that. I think it's fun to play with. It's almost like a video game in a way. If you're just doing images to like for fun, not for jobs. I think it's still like the jury's still out about what's going to do. I was thinking that one really safe thing to do that I may incorporate with my students, if they want to play with it, is to use dead artists.
Right.
Because if you use dead artists, like if you're doing like things that look like Magritte and Picasso and, you know, Michelangelo, like all that's like copyright issues out the window, because you're using public domain imagery anyway. So, and you can get so many wonderful things in terms of sources. But I believe that eventually I think it will be incorporated into the creative process. I think in brainstorming and coming up with ideas and even doing things, creating images like that, and then doing manual renderings and going back and forth and stuff, you know, just like Photoshop can be incorporated, but in a much more massive sort of like image generating blah, blah, blah. It's not like Photoshop at all, but it could be used in something like that eventually.
That's how I've been using it since doing the comic, where we were purposely using just those images. I've been using it just as part of my flow. And as an educator, I think Sean's concern and your concern about bringing it to the faculty, those those are my biggest concerns now, is from the educational standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
It really changes what you're teaching, and I still haven't wrapped my mind around exactly how it changes it, but it's very much, I think, talking to Dave McKean about it, because we got to talk to him, because we got him into
Midjourney.
We got him into Midjourney, which is why he made that book.
And said, Dave, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sorry that we've done this. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but here's your invite.
So
did you interview Dave for this program?
Yeah. We'll send you a link.
Because I know that he had, after he did that little book, he had a lot of mixed feelings about it. And I think that I'm glad that you, Carson, and Dave did what you did, because I think you well, first of all, you got some really good results. But in addition to that, you open up the discussion in a way that nobody had before. And I think that at the same time, your comic was not literal in any way, shape, or form. It wasn't like the kind of goals that neither was Dave's, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
And those are not the kind of goals that 99.99999% of users are looking for. They're doing like sexy girl on the beach, riding a motorcycle, with manga face and the dragon flying behind them,
Yeah, it was really important to us, I think. Well, I have a background in philosophy of information as well. And so this is something I've been thinking about and talking about. And my fine art career was about, like, if you look at my paintings from 2016 to 2018, I, like, when Midjourney came out, I was like, hey, that looks like my paintings. Like I've been predicting this. And so when we got access and I sent Sean the image and he said, we got to do a comic, I was like, yes, we need to do the first one and make sure that the first one is an intelligent grappling with. And that's the same thing Dave did, is it has to grapple with it, rather than, hey, I can't draw, but I can make my sci-fi story now. Like, if that had been the first one to come out, that would have been a real tragedy.
I think both of us were, and Dave as well, are imagining the art director perspective, like those people see the artist sometimes as a necessary evil. We are the interference between them and the product, right? And you can imagine all the overheated conversations that must have been happening in all the art director offices when this first, came into public usage. And so I think that it was very important that the first, statements, and it's fantastic. I mean, it's a real pleasure. I mean, the fact that I got to publish this and work with Carson on it, and the fact that we got to help Dave be part of that as well, and like the fact that those two things were both announced at the same time. I mean, it felt important to me, and it still feels kind of important to me that like it started off that conversation, even though we ended up getting a tremendous amount of pushback from people who were like, don't you know this is the devil's technology? And it's like, did you read the thing?
Have you talked to Paul Gravett about it?
Yeah, Paul shared. Yeah, we were discussing with Paul, and he shared the early press releases and stuff, and
I know he was really heavily promoting it, and he's the most knowledgeable person in the world when it comes to comics. And he's always been a promoter of new technology to make comics. I mean, AI is going to affect everything. As we know, it's certainly already having a potentially devastating effect in concept art. I feel comics are safe because even though they are making hands with 5 fingers and things like that, the amount of interest worldwide to make comics using a program is microscopic compared with everything else. Manga pinups, spaceships, whatever. Like, it's microscopic. It's not worth their while to invest the money in something that can actually do storytelling and narrative in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
And so I think the comics are safe from it in that sense. I think that what you were talking about, Carson, in terms of like incorporating into the image making process, I think that's likely, and I think not undesirable in my opinion. What I'm doing academically is I'm teaching more handmade techniques. Like I'm teaching watercolor right now.
Mm.
And
Fantastic.
I'm going to be doing a mixed media class. I encourage my students to work in traditional materials, but then, they can Photoshop stuff later and stuff like that. And I think at some point I can see how, especially at the preliminary, everybody's demonizing AI, but I'm thinking like, how about when you, like my students do, you have an assignment, you do a Google image search, and then you base your assignment on the images that come out.
Yeah.
That's another way, just as automatic, to generate imagery that you're going to incorporate into your piece that nobody bats an eyelash.
Right.
And it's exactly as derivative as using computer generated imagery as sources, not as the finished product.
Yeah.
Right.
So I feel that the once things settle, with that whole ownership, infringement, and all that stuff, which I can totally understand why it's happening, and I think it would be clear out eventually. Between the technology, like those filters, like what Carl Ortiz just put. I mean, if I was Midjourney, I would just like you cannot put like big ass in Midjourney. I would do a registry of living artists, and I would say just sign up, and we'll put a filter, and we won't be able to use your name.
Absolutely.
Bang,
Yeah,
done.
there was an interview that Rob Salkovitz at Ford did with the guy at Midjourney, and he floated that to him, and he said, "Oh, that'd be real complicated." And it's like, you trained an AI to paint, you motherfucker, but you're too lazy to train
That is
it
not
not
complicated at all. They could do a directory, and people would sign up. They don't want their work sample, and it would be super easy. And they have to prove that it's them. That is not like you're not saying Pablo Picasso,
That gentleman has utter contempt for the idea. I think all those people just feel like this has been playing with pencils, that all of us elite who know how to play with the pencil are now getting our comeuppance.
Who is that?
Well, the David, the programmer who put together Midjourney, lots of the people who have responded to the types of things, that we put out, like our interview with Dave McKean, in a negative fashion, have said essentially like, well, you guys had your time playing with pencils. You've had your time in the sun, and now everybody knows this is easy. Everybody can do it. There's a kind of contempt.
It sounds very libertarian.
There's an extension of like a socialist redistribution of resources. Like, you special artists, we've now redistributed your skills neener. And like, there was an article by a guy in the Times UK who used AI as a way to leverage an attack on the human creative impulse. And I was predicting that in our chat with Dave, actually. Right. And then like 5 months later, I was like, there you go. I told you that was coming. So that is distressing to me. But I think, I don't know. It's part of what I'm saying as an educator is like, yeah, like regrounding them in material will be good. But I'm also really trying to think about, and this is what Dave McKean said, is he said Midjourney is such a stupid name because it takes the journey out and just jumps you to the end. And so my teaching can no longer be about the end result so much as highlighting, and teaching really should always be about this, but the journey. And it's so hard when you have to assign grades to get the students to pay attention to what they're learning and what they're gaining from the experience of doing.
Well, I totally agree with you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Like what I do is I always grade. Preliminaries are as important for the grade as the finished product.
That's smart.
So if they have amazing illustration and the preliminaries are crap, they're not going to. And if they have really strong preliminaries and the finished one could be better, they're going to get it.
I might try and take that up.
But I think that's the way to make sure that they get involved in the process, and they don't just do the first idea that comes to their mind and just spend 1 million hours making it look, shiny.
That's smart. And I've been using like the AI as like, you have to use the AI in this project, but you can't just turn in the thing that printed out. Like like I'm assigning projects where you have to collage, or you have to, depending on which class, you have to have an element from it while you use these other elements, or you have to use it for like some part of the process, but it can't be in the end result. And so I'm trying to integrate it instead of stay away from it. And I like, we talked to Luciano Floridi, who's an acquaintance of mine, who's a big philosopher of digital ethics and stuff, and he just released a piece too that had some really good ideas for like English professors, because the chat GPT is even bigger deal for them than for us.
For sure.
And he was putting out good ideas that he had always used, because he's a good teacher. And it was like, oh, I will have them generate something with chat GPT, and then instead of having them force them to research where chat GPT got it wrong, and make them critically analyze the piece that chat GPT wrote. So I think there's ways to incorporate some of those types of processes into our teaching too. I just haven't.
The first time I used ChatGPT, I was like, "Who's Jose Villarubia?" And it's like, Spanish artist, blah blah blah. Best known for their coloring, blah blah blah. Notable works include Hellshock, blah blah blah, Sandman, From Hell, Watchmen, and Mouse.
And Mouse?
And Mouse.
Well,
and
congratulations on being a Pulitzer Prize winner.
And it was like, answer to the ChatGPT, we really didn't do these things. Oh, I'm so sorry. And then it's like Saga, or like.
And so that was his recommendation, is having them forcing a research project where, instead of just, we need you to generate an essay, purposely make them generate an essay, because then they get what they want, but then you have to do something with it. So I've been thinking about that.
And the program itself tells you, I'm just a writing program and not a research, like it tells you, if you ask it, it tells you why it gets things wrong, because that's not how it's meant to be used to begin with.
Yeah.
But I feel that it's everything, there's music being composed that way, as you know, and one of the artists was signed up by a company, a hip-hop artist, and it's going to affect. I know that for animation is a real threat right now. I feel that I like what you're talking about, what I interpret as cautiously embracing it. I think there's ignoring it doesn't make it any better. And I think that demonizing it, to me, doesn't make it better either. I think that setting some boundaries when it comes to like, it already has boundaries because it's completely censored. So it's like, they can censor whatever they think is interesting. If they feel that living illustrators deserve to not, if you take Midjourney and you say James Jean, it does like one of the many styles that James does, it does it beautifully. It's just one of the like 100 styles that he can do. But that shouldn't be, James' name should not be,
right.
A prompt. It should be like, ass. So,
I got a Mike Mignola last night. I sent it to Sean and I was like, holy shit. It can't do Jim Lee yet. It's got the coloring from Jim Lee. I was actually curious about that. Are you worried about it? I'm a bit worried after the Jim Lee one that I saw last night, because it was Alex Sinclair colors 100%. It can't render like Jim Lee yet, but I'm thinking, shit, are we almost to the point where you scan a black and white and you just say color it,
I saw there's a new software that hasn't been released that actually does coloring. Jesus. I saw it with some samples, and it's for manga drawings, and it does that kind of like Josh Middleton sort of coloring with like very soft rendering and like a hot highlight with some rim light on the back. It does that beautifully. On something that is just line art and doesn't have light source in the drawing or anything like that. That's very impressive for one, but you cannot color a comic with that effect in every page, in every panel.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm saying, that comics are safe, because even if you get coloring for single illustrations that can look impressive until you see it 100 times and you know exactly how it was done.
Yeah.
I feel that the panel to panel sequentiality, which is the essence of the medium, is like they're not going to put the time in it because why? Why would they do that? And so I think that's I'm not afraid of them. And if it ever gets really good, then I'll go back to painting the pages in watercolor like I was doing in Hellshock.
I'll be very excited for that.
It used to take me so many hours to do each page. It was,
I bet.
I was a very eager young man then.
It's fantastic work, and it holds up extremely well. We had a wonderful time spinning through all those pages, and the narrative color question I had is specific one that I'm thinking of is you have such a muted sequence throughout the entire thing because of
that was the third one.
Reading that, I was just like, well, this is a guy who's incredibly smart and knows exactly what he wants from the beginning of the process. But I wanted to hear you say it.
Thank you. So you were looking at my old. That was like the first thing I did, and the fourth one had all those sepia sequences, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the second series, the fourth issue, is the one where she's in, whether it's an imaginary landscape or whatever, she's in jail for the majority of the time.
And, you saw the recolored version though,
as well. No, I read it. No, I read it scans of the original. Yeah. Right, the third one. Thank you.
June, Jay's wife finished the series when it was collected by Dynamite. I was offered to do it, but Jay had lost the color separations, so it would have meant to recolor it. And all of those pages were initially painted, so I told him I didn't want to do it. And so June recolor the trade, which is fine. But I mean, I look at that work and I did some crazy things. I did some crazy things in Fantastic Four 1, 2, 3, 4, like monochromatic sequences and all kinds of stuff. But I had a lot of, other than no blood and no cigars, I had to get, like, for the first 5 pages, the Thing, after beating up some bad guys, pulls out a cigar and lights it. And then when he goes into the Baxter building, the cigar smoke is like a wall of that isolates him from the other members. Well, after it was drawn and colored, I got the editorial note: there's no smoking in the Marvel universe.
Okay.
So you see, like, the Thing sort of gesticulates.
They're going to have to go back in time and talk to John Byrne and Terry and oh my goodness,
Steranko, everybody.
How do you do?
What did you do?
I erased the cigar and the cigar, and the smoke and all that stuff, and he acts a little weird in those.
Yeah, isn't Wolverine always chewing on a cigar and Nick Fury?
Not during that, not during that era, because there was no smoking. Like, Wolverine couldn't smoke. I did a Simon Bisley story in which at the end, Wolverine grabs $100 bill, lights it on fire, and lights up his cigar with it. I know there was going to be censored, so I censored it myself. He lights the Thing, puts the cigar, there's nothing there. And it's just like this. That's the end.
Oh, man.
There was a panel in Cage by Corben where Corben drew his penis.
I can imagine a nice, big, thick one.
I was like, I'm not gonna wait for just get out. I know what they're gonna say. It's so that was like, okay.
But you said you were a very eager young man in terms of the putting in all the detail, but I just have to say, like, none of those early jobs that you did have any of the kind of things that I associate with that type of, like, wanting to show off what you can do. All of them are in service of the story, which is what makes those colors so remarkable.
Well, thank you. What happened is I was an eager young colorist, but I was not an eager young person anymore. I was in my late 30s. Right. So I was like, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything in terms of, like, my artistic skills or how many colors I can put in one picture. So the fact that I entered the field a little older and that I had a couple of careers before really gave me the maturity to not be trying to do flashy stuff. So I guess that worked out okay, because if I had started coloring comics when I was 20, I probably would have done some things I regretted later.
Yeah. Well, and I think you were talking about how you let the artwork suggest the style you took, and that was the thing. That was the thing that I think left such an impression on me, is I had never seen colors that felt so of akin with art, because I hadn't seen like European stuff yet, you know, painted comics and things like that. So it was like with Jay Lee's crazy Bill Sienkiewicz kind of wild spraying and scratching, and I mean he's cleaned up since then, but back then it was wildness.
Yeah, influence was, you know, Simon Bisley mostly and Bill Sienkiewicz. I introduced him to a lot of European artists like Topi and stuff. He borrowed this book I have by Dino Battaglia of all his horror stories, and he kept it like for 10 years. And, I also shot photo references for him to work from. He was working completely from imagination, and I told him he should really look at real life because everybody was so grotesque. And so I shot reference for him, and which he used. And so a lot of his work became very reference and photo based, and that really was a huge improvement. And yeah, but we, you know, Jay was only in college for one semester and he dropped out. So since I was already a college professor by the time we met, I would always share information with him in a very sort of mentorial kind of way, and he liked it. He loved that, you know, because he would get very inspired by things that had not even been published in America, like Topi or Battaglia.
Yeah. And it just seemed like, I think that was the first time, I think what I was trying to say is the first time where I felt like it was unified. Like it's so hearing you say that there was like a mentorship relation and stuff, it really, yeah, it looks like a collaboration. It looks like two people working together kind of with a common vision in mind. Like the colors do the same type of things that the ink work does, which I had never seen before. It was just ink work.
I remember like when we did the cover of Fantastic Four #3, which is Namor is like throwing the Human Torch into the water, and he drew it and he wanted to have big flames of the Human Torch being like, you know, extinguished by the water. And I was like, don't draw the flames, let me paint them, because I can paint them just as well. So I painted all those flames and he never drew them. And I was happy because he would have drawn very stylized frames that would have been very hard to turn into flames. So, you know, but he trusted me, obviously. And, you know, I think that's, he was very picky, of course. And, but, you know, if I wouldn't have worked in comics if it wasn't for Jay. He actually made publishers hire me when they would have slammed the door in my face because too artistic, you know. So I owe him everything. He bought all my equipment for me when I, you know, didn't have the money. Scanners were super expensive back then.
Yeah,
right. And so you know, he really helped. And then what happened is, like, once I did the first job with Jay, then I worked with other editors at Marvel with the crossovers of the century, like Mike Martz and Mike Wright, and they liked working with me, and then they gave me work from then on. Like, all they had to was to work with me once, and then, you know, that was it. Once that barrier was broken, then they would just send me other jobs.
Well, thank goodness. Thank you, Jay Lee, for bringing that sensibility to American comics.
And thank you. And thank you, Jose, for taking so much time with us and talking about so many different topics. And thank both of you guys for being the type of teachers who actually talk about the things that you're gaining from the experience of doing it. I mean, I think that that's a tremendous thing, and it's more and more important given the current state of you know, the changes that are in the air. So
thank you. Well, thank you for the interest.
Oh, you got some good illuminated. We'll
Why?
send you a copy of the Abolition of Man
Look
with a
at
nice
that.
illuminated
That was
cover
like
like
my
that.
ear. This is so weird.
Yeah, this is weird. The AI has taken over.
Okay,
So
hold on.
but before we go though, the Swamp Thing recolors out now, correct? And people can get that.
Yes.
And then the Den, can you give a timeline of those, how they're going to
Yes,
release?
it's going to come out right after San Diego. So at the very end of July, beginning of August, it would be for sale for the first volume. The second volume would be for sale in October, and it's already finished. Third volume hasn't been announced yet, but expected to see it soon after that.
Okay.
Fantastic.
And then
really looking forward to seeing
Facebook
it.
and Instagram, and you'll see a lot of awesome, like for those tech nerds on our channel.
High quality posts. Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic stuff. This is the first I became aware of you is when you started doing these from the colorist perspective posts, and really great stuff, and very interesting aesthetic application of many of the things that we've been talking about to older comics pages. So thank you for doing those. That
Well,
series.
thank you. I had so much fun, and I learned doing them because I mean I was using my teaching ness in making them, but because so many thoughtful and well-informed and experienced professionals started to add more and more information, it was like I was sharing information, but I was also getting a lot of information,
Right.
which is the best because there was a true exchange. And then, many people told me that when we had to be in confinement, like those posts cheer them up. Like they would just open Facebook just to read whatever I was posting that day. And I never tried to make it very in-depth or very long. Like I always keep up, like trying to make it entertaining. And so that was nice to know that, it was a constructive endeavor. And I feel, they asked me to do a book. Many people said, why don't you do? It's like, I don't want to do a book. They asked me to do like Patreon. It's like, I don't want to charge for it. Like, I don't want to edit it. I don't want to organize all those thoughts. It's like, plus you cannot do it. Like all the work I use is copyrighted. So to do it in a book would be problematic. And without the illustrations, there is nothing to be said.
Yeah.
So I was like, Facebook is the format I like for those. It wouldn't work on Instagram. It couldn't work on Twitter. Couldn't work in any other thing. But in Facebook, you can put it in an album and go at certain length. So anyone can make a profile with a picture of a cat and then just go and look at it.
I was going to say, damn it, now I got to get back on Facebook again because I was just following the Instagram stuff. So there's more.
Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely check it out. And if you ever decide that you want to work with somebody to put it together as a book, let me know. I'll be happy to be the person who says, damn it, I don't care. Put the pictures on there anyway.
Oh my God, we'll be sued out to the stratosphere if we do that because...
You got to just make sure we balance it enough across different potential people who can sue you.
So John has a strong record of not giving a crap about being sued, as we can attest to with the Abolition of Man.
As you can imagine, like once I was asked to do the absolute Swamp Thing and such a fast schedule too.
Right.
Like I was like, oh my God, people are going to look at this with a microscope after I dish so much stuff, like 400 posts. And I was like, all right. Like I always do my best, but in this one, I really had to do my best. And I think that the response has been overwhelmingly positive, despite those people in the message boards that I don't even know what happened with them. I only look a couple times and I was like, whatever. It just seemed like it was really out of the mainstream type of discussion anyways.
Yeah, it's just the internet. It's just the internet.
Yeah, everybody.
They probably haven't even read the book.
Oh no, they just personal insults.
Yeah.
I think that's fine. I think that I've done a signing for it and people were super excited. People have written to me telling me how excited they were. I think a lot of people wanted something like this. Wrightson was the perfect person to do it with because the work is so incredibly solid. The colors are so beautiful. he colors several of the issues himself,
Mm.
and the the absolutes can be too thick and really uncomfortable to read, but this one is not. It's just about right. The only problem is too expensive, but I imagine that they're going to be using the same files for future editions of these stories, for future trade paperbacks and international editions and so forth.
Hopefully.
So that's a really positive thing, I feel. And hopefully, I mean, I talked to the editor. I said, what would you like me to do next? I'm trying to get a different company to, like I posted the other day, I wanted to Barry Smith's Conan. I've been trying to do that for a decade. I asked Marvel, I asked Dark Horse. I'd love to do the Buscema issues of Conan, the pen and ink ones, the ones that he inked, where he put the most work.
Right.
This would be really great to do. I'd love to do the Shadow.
Oh,
that would be the Kaluta Shadow would be really great. I'd love to do the Carson of Venus by Kaluta, but that's like, there's no way they can approve something so obscure. And there's a lot of other things that I like, that I would like to get involved. Neil Adams stuff I love, and I would like to do it. But Marvel just put out, for example, the Kree-Skrull War in a very large format, like the Weapon X thing, but with the blinding colors that they always do.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, there goes that market. So
this is like at the end of an MMA fight where we say, Jose Villarubia, who do you want next? And you call your shot.
Next. This is what I'm doing. Taking on Neil Adams. I'm gonna get him back in print.
You were saying, I think before we started recording, that you like the idea of collections of artists rather than runs of books.
Oh yes.
And I think that's a great idea. Like, here's the Neil Adams omnibus remastered, recolored, or something like that, or at least Neil Adams on this character or something.
Most fans follow characters, not creators.
Yeah.
That's just the way it is, but I've always followed creators, even when I didn't know their names. Like in the Spanish reprints, Marvel Comics and DC Comics were not credited. So my brothers and I, we made up names for them. Yeah, because they had no names. So the one I remember vividly that we made up a name was Neil Adams, because he was so different from, you had the Inhumans drawn by Jack Kirby, and the following issue was Neil Adams. And he was like, whoa, what happened here? So we call him the Futurist.
Oh.
That was his nickname, because he just seemed from the future compared with like Steve Ditko, which looked like, medieval in comparison. Yeah. So we had nicknames for them, and I always would buy comics because of the artist, not because of the character, until I started to buy comics because of the writer, which started with Steve Gerber, who I would just buy comics because Steve Gerber wrote them. I didn't care who the character was. And Steve Englehart to some extent. And then, of course, much later, the British invasion and all that stuff. But I've always followed artists and eventually writers. And I just couldn't really, I never had an emotional attachment towards any character, because the moment that you had an attachment with a character, they would change the creative teams, and it was like not the same at all. It was like whatever you were feeling, I wasn't feeling it any longer with somebody else doing it, because it looked different or their stories were very different. So yeah, I'm still stuck in that track of like not respecting the artists and the writers out of like an ethical concern, but just out of a taste.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's the mature model, and I think that is the place where, places like Random House, who are releasing, most successful comic book coming out this year or the previous year or the year before that is Dave Pilkey's Dogman series, published as a serial in hardback. You know that no one else is going to draw Dogman. This is Dave Pilkey's comic. His name is just as big as Dogman's name on the cover, and the kids know who he is.
Right.
And that is the way of the future, but it is up to these companies to decide whether they want to be part of that or not, you know?
Walt Disney presents.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's an acknowledgement. It's a tacit acknowledgement that the creator mattered, you know, and that's an argument that they're not always willing to make.
No,
But
they're not.
really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much, and thank you.
My
everyone,
pleasure.
Love to have you back sometime at some point.
For sure.
Great.
All right.
Thank you so much, Jose. Have a good one, everybody.
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.